Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this episode of The Federal. I'm Naved Anjum, and I have two very distinguished guests on the show today. Mr. Chandan Gowda, who is Ramakrishna Hegde Chair Professor of Decentralization Studies at the Institute for Social and Economic Change, Bengaluru, and a very prolific columnist. Also joining me today is Mr. N. Manu Chakravarthy, a visiting professor of film and culture theory at several universities and film institutes, and a prominent culture critic who has written extensively on music, cinema, literature, and several aspects of culture and philosophy. They are the co-editors of the essential You Are Ananthamurthy, which Aleph Book Company has published recently. It brings together a collection of Ananthamurthy's best fictional and non-fictional works, poetry, and autobiographical writings as well. Ananthamurthy was, of course, one of the most influential and vocal writers of modern India. Over the course of his career, which lasted more than 5 decades, he authored 5 novels, multiple collections of short stories, poetry, and essays, a play, and an autobiography. In recognition of his contributions to Indian literature, he was awarded the prestigious Janan Preet Award in 1994 and was also a finalist for the Man Booker International Prize in 2013. The essential You Are Ananthamurthy gives us a glimpse into his mind and why his works will continue to inspire generations to come. Mr. Gowda and Mr. Chakravarthy, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you both with us today.
Thank you.
Naveen.
Thank you so much, Navai.
Well, to begin in earnest, my question to both of you would be how in fact, and that is something just a starter to how both of you arrived at your Ananthamurthy's work, extensive body of work, in fact, across genres. And what struck you as the most fascinating aspect of his writing across genres? That is.
Manu,
I would like Chandan to begin because I want to make it clear that this book really marks his outstanding contribution. I don't think I've had much to do with it, but he has really been the spine, the backbone in a literal sense. So I would like you to have him talk first.
thank you, Manu. Manu, you are being modest. So Naved, since you asked an autobiographical sort of a question,
Right.
my father was his Dr. Ananthamurthy student in Mysore in the 60s.
Yes. Yes.
And so even before I had met him, I'd heard about him a lot from my father and about his novel Samskara, of course, and about his experience with him as a student in the classroom and outside. And he would drop in at home occasionally. And I remember meeting him properly, I think in my college days, when I was doing my third year BA. And I was planning to do my MA at that time. And I remember him saying, JNU is a good choice for you to do your MA. And so that was how and then his son, who had just returned from the US at that time, became close to me. And that just evolved into its own relationship with the family. And yes, and I translated his Bara, which is his long short story. And I also did a series of video interviews of his in 2012, which were telecast on television. Yeah, so my association with him is of this kind, and he would occasionally read what I wrote, and I would respond, to ongoing politics, the petition drafting he would do, what we would comment on, things like that. I was also in Bangalore. I returned soon after my PhD. And I must also say, when I was doing a PhD, my PhD at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, I managed to invite him to give a talk. He was also visiting at UPenn. Sorry, these are all, more or less anecdotal details, but if you wanted to know what kind of relation it was, I mean, there is all this. But I'll come to the intellectual part a little later, but I think Manu should tell us how he came to know him.
Yeah, so before Manu starts, I just wanted to ask Mr. Gaur, because you were talking about those process. I also wanted to ask you a question about, his I think perhaps one of the most significant work after his death, and that was your conversation with him when during his last years when he was on dialysis, and that book came out I think 2020 when HarperCollins published it as a Life in the World. Your
Yes.
conversations with him. If you could briefly talk about that, and then we can of course go to
Yes. Naved, if you know the video lectures that I told you I recorded with him on Kannada writers, those were recorded in the morning. And since the entire crew were essentially available for the whole day, it was an afterthought. I just felt we should all hang around till evening when he would be fresh again to speak. And then it was a series of conversations in English. At that time, I wasn't aware he was writing his autobiography in Kannada. So I thought we must have an autobiography, sort of a thing in English. And that's, those were transcribed and then edited by me and published as a book a few years after he passed away. Yeah. Manu?
Is it the same question, Navaid?
Yeah, the question about how you arrived at his work and what was your, in fact, the impressions of his work and his, of course, what struck you the most about his writing.
Well, again, this is going a bit autobiographical.
Yes.
He was my teacher at Mans Gangotri, MA, between 75 and 77. And Samskara had already become very famous. Bhartipura had created quite a bit of a stir. And most interesting was there were some short stories he would write. And he was part of our tutorials batch. And in manuscript form, he would read it out to us. So even before they were published, he would discuss them with us in the tutorials classes. And it was very important for us to engage with a writer of his stature. So here was a teacher, here was a creative writer, and a person who was very, very close, very dear to his students. And you see, it was more of an emotional, creative collaboration. And I must also mention that when Avaste, much before it was published, he used to read it out in installments to a group of people. So much before he had finalized it, there were 12 to 14 sessions at the Institute of Correspondence course. Many people had participated in that. And one of the first interviews before publication was my interview over the All India Radio with Ananthamurthy on Avaste. So you see, if you were to ask me what kind of a relationship, it was a relationship between a teacher and a student, a writer and his readers, first readers. And the kind of relationship we had was intellectual, creative, emotional. And this continued until his death in 2014. Not a day. And you see, this was the kind of relationship I would include Chandan too. Not a relationship which was purely at the public realm. It was a very, very personal, individual relationship, largely emotional. And if we didn't call, either Chandan or I, if we didn't call, he would always call me back and say, "You are not the one to call. I must keep track of you." So this was a very, very personal relationship, very endearing relationship. And Chandan and I believe that a very wholesome understanding of several dimensions of Indian culture, not just Indian society, several dimensions of Indian culture are captured from his very early stories, his first novel, Samskara, to his last work. So it was Chandan's decision. He got me going and said, we must bring out a fairly definitive volume, which would be comprehensive, but which would also be incisive, particular. These are the origins of this text, Navaid.
Right. No, this is a great service you have done to the literature lovers, and especially those who have, admired the writing of as significant a writer as you are, Ananthamurthy. I was also wondering about the process of selection, considering the kind of relationship both of you had with him. What was the process of choosing from his vast body of work, and in what ways do you sort of does this selection represent his literary and intellectual legacy? Both you both can pick up on that.
Yeah, Naveed, before I address this question, I felt I left part of your first question unaddressed. That was, what was the intellectual attractions of him for me?
Yes.
And to put it very, very concisely, I was a student of social science, and social science in India has always had a certain kind of an unease, an intellectual unease, that it is somehow not quite explaining Indian society properly. And what is explanating, a proper explanation is, can have different sorts of engagements. But the idea is that there was something about modern intellectual frameworks that didn't seem to quite work satisfyingly. So here we had a writer who I felt had grappled with this difficulty, the intellectual difficulty, which also means political difficulty, moral difficulty of, there is liberalism that offers you a normative framework as well as a certain naturalized framework for looking at the world. And you also realize that, in Indian society, for all the efforts at modernizing it over the last 250 years by Indians as well as non-Indians, continues to, live and, exist on its own terms, defying all these, heavy institutional designs, trying to, remodel it along a certain other philosophical grounding. So I felt that Ananthamurthy had done this consistently, and this was a long-standing problematic for him. And if you realize now, the time I was being apprenticed in social science, it was also the time of post-colonial studies, etc. And I was always struck at how the post-colonial studies that had emerged as a canon in the US and in India had completely overlooked how a set of Indian writers had actually grappled with essentially the same set of questions much before this field came to be constituted as post-colonial studies, and had actually addressed it in a richer way. So I had felt there was something deeply wrong about this, amnesia. So there was all these other reasons why, I was very, very, very drawn to the writings of your. Sorry, this took me longer than I thought it would.
No, very. No, it's interesting to.
Yeah. So Manu, you're right, Navaid. I mean, he's written it. He's over the last six and a half decades, he wrote a lot, and in a variety of genres: the short story, the novel, poetry, and the essay form. And Manu, there's also a play that is written, which I have not read. Manu has read it. So how do we, go about choosing from all of this? And he also wrote an autobiography towards the very end of his life in Kannada. Translated excerpts from it are in this book. I think Manu should also have a share with us what he had in mind when we both settled on these texts. The novels, of the 5 of his novels, 4 of them have been translated to English. So we picked out those excerpts that we felt conveyed, invited the reader into that particular novel in the best possible. And the short stories, he's written many, several short story anthologies, and it was tough to choose from them. But here is where I think we felt each story must be opening up a different kind of a fictional experience, as well as the kind of ethical question that it throws up. Each one we felt had to be different, and that was our logic of selection. Poetry was a bit more random, I would think. It's not. I don't think this is a represent. Well, I think some of them are indeed representative. Manu can say more about the choice of poems. The non-fiction, he wrote many volumes in Kannada, and these are except for one essay that has been translated into English by Manu, every other non-fiction piece in the essays and criticism part was originally written in English. And we had a discussion about, are we, but then how did we feel justified in including them? We felt these essays helped address the variety of concerns that he had addressed in the Kannada writings as well. So we didn't feel that not translating freshly more essays for this book was doing the book a disservice, because we felt the big thematic concerns of his that you find in Kannada writings of criticism were also here. And we avoided a few pieces of criticism that were so completely specialized and directed towards a Kannada audience, thinking that an all India audience may not be sufficiently enthused by that. But yeah, Manu.
It's just an extension of what Chandan has been trying to say. In fact, what helped us was the fact that Chandan is not a conventional, regular social scientist, because he also believes in narratives, the creative element that goes into the construction of what you would generally call sociology. So there is something imaginative about Chandan that helped us. The first thing, when you talk of the criteria of selection, the first thing was that we were looking at a writer who tried to capture Indian realities through their contradictions, paradoxes, dualities, without putting them into one category or the other. So to read Ananthamurthy is also to look at the multiple kinds of contradictions that India as a society. Chandan pointed it out at a different level. So much as India included several things, it became more and more inclusive, but it did not truly lose sight of its traditional past, the multiple traditions. Now, all these have gone into it. So if you try to classify Ananthamurthy, you say we would have to classify him for one reason, historically speaking, as a Navya writer, a modernist. But here is a writer who goes against modernity, talks against tradition, but is inclusive of tradition. So this was the kind of inclusivity that attracted us. Second, again, you see Ananthamurthy turns to public discourses, historical, sociological facts. But what Chandan and I found interesting was that you also construct the inner world, shall we say, the metaphysics of individuals. So it's not entirely sociological. And it's the balance that he tries to strike as a creative writer between the inner worlds of individuals, men and women, and the world, the historical context in which they are caught, trapped, which they must confront, that these creative negotiations take place in Ananthamurthy's fiction. So even if you turn to his non-fictional writings, call it ideological writings, there's always Ananthamurthy trying to revise, reconstruct, and reimagine his earlier positions. So since both Chandan and I are interested in these processes, creative processes, it was very important for us, and it became easy for us when we dealt with a writer like Ananthamurthy to pick texts that really supplemented, that really gave us the strength to further our arguments, that here is a writer who displays without any sense of fear the contradictions, the dualities, and these come from the kinds of realities that India, even as a post-colonial society, to use that expression, was negotiating with. So these multiple trajectories, and we only saw, Chandan and I saw them as not opposites, binary opposites, but as very interesting, fascinating, creative juxtapositions.
Right. Very well said. I also wondering about. I'm wondering about this trajectory, his trajectory, and let us go a little back in time and look at some of the intellectual and literary influences of him before he wrote his first novel, Samskara, when he was a student in Birmingham and he was studying English literature to get recognition in English. But then he decided to write in Kannada instead. And one wonders what could have propel the decision to write in Kannada? And we'll come to the novel and other writings later, but just this question about why did he choose to write in Kannada, and of course his later association with and ideas on language and literature, especially Indian languages and Kannada particularly.
He himself has, luckily for us, he himself has answered your question in one of his essays, saying that thinking and transacting in English in England tired his mind. And writing in Kannada gave him an extraordinary sense of respite from English, which was beginning to strain him. But I think this is just one formulation, which actually hides a whole host of other sorts of inner urges that may have mattered in how you choose a language for the story you want to tell. And this is not usually it's not a decision; it's something else that drives you to settle for one linguistic medium to do it. So I would allow for a certain sense of not knowing in how this writing in Kannada happened inside England. But yeah, I think Manu, do you want to?
Just this additional distinction that he felt comfortable only at the intellectual level, ideational level with English, but he always felt spiritually, emotionally attached, that he thought he could express his emotional feelings, that emotional world better in his Kannada. And therefore, there was that sense of immediacy with Kannada and a sense of distance with English, which he thought was adequate for his intellectual purposes, but not adequate enough to give full expression to his emotional self. And he was trying to be equally emotional and not let the intellectual dimension, the rational dimension, take over. And you see, rooted in the Kannada tradition, literary cultural tradition, and also with his traditional roots, you must remember that he grew up learning Sanskrit as a Brahmin boy. So there was that kind of unconscious affinity. And in a way, he used to say quite often that the language chose him for reasons of these emotional reasons.
Yeah. And Naveed, we speak of English and Kannada as a set of, as two different languages. But if you think about his intellectual influences, a lot of it is from English and broadly European and American. D.H. Lawrence mattered to him immensely. And so, so there's this way in which English has a presence in his writing, in the sense of a source of literary imagination, a kind of a literary quest, that he may have felt like sharing with someone else, etc. So in that sense, we can't strictly make it a question of either or. Yes, he did write in Kannada, but what kind of an experiential world does he make available in Kannada? That's a complex thing. His roots will be, spread all over outside Karnataka society.
Right. I'm also wondering about the kind of, the world that he came from, and and as a Brahmin, and what was the thematic concerns in not just his novels but much of his work. Were they in some sort of influenced by where he came from the political ideas that he lived with, and we were talking about the literary influences and intellectual and political influences as well. You talk about in the introduction about Shiva Ramakrishna and then Kevempu and then Ramakrishna Lohiya, and how did they basically shape his political and social beliefs that reflected in his works.
Manu, do you want to?
Navaid, I missed the first part of your statement. Can you kindly repeat it?
So I was saying that do you see his the kind of background that he came from as a Brahmin boy growing up in that in that particular milieu of the time, and how did that inform the thematic concerns of his work, particularly his novels? And of course, they also reflect in his essays and memoir, but more so in his novels, perhaps. And also these ideas that how in what ways do you see these the influences of Shivarama Karant, Kevempu, Ram Manohar Lohia, all these people when he was influenced when he was at the University of Mysore.
I will respond to two writers in particular, because it can go on and on for a long time. When he read especially Kuvempu, Puttappa, his two extraordinary novels, he was not fascinated by his poetry to begin with. He saw himself as entering a domain which, as a Brahmin boy, or in his earlier fictions, he never had access to that world. So Kuvempu opened up, and because of the magnitude of Kuvempu's imagination, he saw himself stepping into which him entry into several aspects of a culture, of a landscape which he had not entered at all, though they came from Malnad. And in particular, he mentions Chomana Dudi, Choma's drum, Shivaram Karan, and says it was some kind of an explosion, an implosion, as it were, that he began to see Choma, an untouchable, as somebody very much like him. So how can I ever think of, so it was experiential. His association with the caste system, his understanding of the caste system, and his upbringing as a Brahmin boy. Now, this changed, of course, through the socialism of Ram Manohar Lohia and others, but experientially. Now, as a creative writer, he saw that the person, the other person, the untouchable, whoever he was very much like a human being like him. So it was this sense of human solidarity, spiritual solidarity, shall we say, that really opened him up to go beyond the caste system which he was a product of. So I would place emphasis on, apart from his intellectual ideological positions, the fact that as a young child he had this emotional, it was almost like a gestalt to see the person banished, boycotted, treated as an untouchable, very much like himself at a fundamental human level. Now, this I think is very important for a writer because he has always talked of his creative processes. And if you read a very important interview with Shivaram Karan, all these things come out. I would like Chandan to tell a bit.
Navai, Manu mentioned earlier that he learned Sanskrit in the Agrahara he grew up in. That is traditional education. But he also went to a government school where you are in a classroom with students from a variety of caste community backgrounds. So that for him also has meant a lot in terms of helping him contrast the orthodox world in which he was growing up, and then the other world he was also interacting with, and the school teachers. And in high school is when he reads Karan's Chomandudi and Kuvempu's novel, and they were, they had excited him. But then, in his, PUC days, he comes to become close to Gopal Gowda, who's a socialist leader, an important socialist leader there, and he encounters the thought of Lohia. He's already heard of Gandhi from his father, but I think intellectually, Manu should say, if he agrees with me here, I feel Lohia as a theoretical mind seems to have mattered more to him in his initial years, the Samskara days, and Gandhi in the 70s. I think intellectually the engagement becomes deeper, and but they were always there. I've heard him say, Lohia is for me the person, in terms of thinking about Indian socialism, and how do you address this thing called Indian culture. So Lohia's famous statement, Marxism is Europe's last weapon against Asia, was something that he actually took very seriously. That a certain radicalism, a certain leftism, if you will, has to emerge from here. And I think that was a lifelong struggle, and from different angles. Like Manu said earlier, the question of the inner self, which usually politics chooses not to talk about in its interest with external institutional arrangements. How do you ensure equality of outcomes, economic egalitarianism, right? So the question of the self is usually put aside, but not for him. And it's not just about what is the self. The self is a source of what meaning seeking. You're trying to find truth on your own terms. It's a self that is, is actually equipping you in an important way to experience the world outside of ideological frames. I think this was a constant thing on his mind. This Avaste, the novel Manu referred to,
Yes.
which is supposed to be based on Gopal Gowda's life. It ends
Yes.
by him who is bedridden, who is longing for a time in childhood where he could simply appreciate a bird on a tree, and just the everyday, the radiance of everyday life, free. I think it is a protest against a certain kind of politicization of the world that had happened. We knew, Heidegger had talked about this is the political age, but I think we inhabit over political age. I mean, it just becomes something else now. So in the middle of all that, you're trying to carve out a socialist concern for yourself and for those around you, while making space alongside for something that could be called creative self-realization, in the middle of everything. Now, how do you, so, and yeah, I think that was an important thing for him. Manu?
Navaid, there is something which I must extrapolate from what Chandan has said. And I think it's a very nuanced position. You see, quite a bit of it come through socialist formations, ideological formations. That's where you can turn to Ramanohar Lohia, Gopal Gowda, all that. But when Chandan said Gandhi, now you see, it became a very important ethical, moral imperative. And therefore, in relation to globalization, capitalization, mechanization, Gandhi had an alternative vision for him. And especially towards the end, deeply troubled by these murderous right-wing fanatics. And that's his last work, which perhaps sums up his vision of life, to turn to Hindutva, Hind Swaraj, because he would always quote Gandhi, especially talking of not the transfer of power, but Khadi, and then Hindu-Muslim unity and eradication of untouchability. So you see, Chandan was pointing it out, and I'm only trying to extrapolate, saying that far beyond, far above these intellectual and these ideological principles, it became important for him to see alternatives to modern civilization, to this global capital and communalism, violence, especially Hindu-Muslim violence. And Gandhi seemed to provide him an answer. I'm not using the word solution, because we always look for answers to problems of the present, through which you look for alternatives. So it's a very important point Chandan has made, that you have an intellectual trajectory, you have a philosophical trajectory, but far more beyond when you look at the crisis of civilization. If you look at the crisis of civilization, Gandhi, and therefore now and then, even as president, chairman of the Sahitya Academy, Central Sahitya Academy, he made sure that Gora, Tagore's, Rabindranath Tagore's Gora became very important, a very important text. Now, all these crossovers are very important, and therefore he ended up, it's just a magnificent tribute to himself that he gave when he wrote Hindutva, Hind Swaraj. And this was the context when he said he does not want to live in India. This was the statement he made when this man, I hate to mention his name, became the prime minister for the first time. I don't even want to utter his name.
Yeah. No, wait, just to, again, I think
that was 2014. That was when he said, and they celebrated his death as Gandhi's death was celebrated by distributing sweets. And in Dakshina Kannada, they burst firecrackers and celebrated sweets. Now, I think that's enough testimony to a man's integrity.
Yeah, and he had seen that happen when Gandhi had died in his own Agrahara. And he calls it an act of hypocrisy that all those who celebrated Gandhi's killing also wrote letters to the Congress party saying that we're unhappy that this happened, etc. So anyway, Navid, very quickly, just to put it in, the Gandhi figure, like Manu was saying just now, at least in two big ways, I mean, in many ways, if you saw a certain dominance of Western intellectual culture over Indian intellectual life. And that is something that Ananthamurthy was very concerned about, and he saw the problem very early, and his entire sort of work reveals a certain critical awareness about how does one try to work autonomously while not rejecting them, of course. They're it's an important intellectual heritage. So Gandhi becomes important there, and also in how this entire thing about you believe there is something called a civilizational something called India, and you also know that there is an ugly side, the dark side. There is so in managing this inheritance called tradition, or even making tradition visible as something for anyone to be attached to or to carry on. The Gandhian method, which is almost like that of an artist, a moral artist, where you are working less as an historian or an archaeologist and more as someone who is feeling free in altering this thing called tradition while actually saying it is tradition, and allowing it to live in the present.